A German officer pressed a submachine gun into an American sergeant's stomach and screamed for surrender. 90 armed enemy soldiers surrounded this lone paratrooper. His 4 men knelt helpless in the snow with their hands behind their heads. The mathematics of survival calculated to absolute zero. What happened in the next 60 seconds would earn this man the highest military decoration his nation could bestow. It would transform a moment of certain death into a legend that paratroopers still whisper about 8 decades later. The sergeant did something nobody expected. He started laughing. And he could not stop. The human mind operates according to patterns established through millions of years of evolutionary pressure. When faced with overwhelming threat, the brain activates ancient survival mechanisms designed to preserve life at any cost. Flight or fight, the textbooks call it. Run from the predator or stand in battle. Surrender represents a third option. A calculated gamble that submission will preserve existence when resistance appears futile. Military training exploits and redirects these instincts. Soldiers learn to override the screaming commands of their amygdala, to advance when every neuron demands retreat, to stand firm when biology insists on flight. Combat veterans describe this process as building a second self, a warrior identity that exists parallel to the civilian person they once were. This warrior self operates on different rules, different calculations, different priorities. Leonard Funk had constructed his warrior self through years of brutal conditioning. Paratrooper training in 1941 represented the most demanding physical and psychological program the United States Army had ever devised. Men who volunteered for airborne duty were not merely seeking adventure or responding to patriotic impulse. They were selecting themselves for a form of warfare that contradicted every rational survival instinct. Jumping from an aircraft at 1,200 feet, trusting fabric and cord to arrest a fall that physics demanded should end in death, required a fundamental rewiring of the human fear response. The men who earned their jump wings had proven they could override their deepest biological programming. They could step into empty air and trust the outcome. This capacity for overriding instinct would prove crucial in situations where normal soldiers would freeze or submit. The farmhouse yard at Holtzheim presented Leonard Funk with a decision matrix that no training manual had ever addressed. 90 armed enemies. 1 Thompson submachine gun with 30 rounds in the magazine. 4 American soldiers disarmed and helpless. 1 German officer with a weapon pressed against his abdomen. Standard military doctrine provided clear guidance for such scenarios. Surrender, preserve life, wait for rescue or opportunity. The Geneva Convention guaranteed certain protections for prisoners of war. Surrender did not mean death, merely captivity. Millions of soldiers on both sides of the conflict had made this calculation and survived to return home after the war ended. The doctrine assumed rational actors on both sides. It assumed that enemies would honor the ancient compact between warriors. It assumed that surrender meant life. Mamadi had shattered that assumption 17 days earlier. The images burned in Funk's memory with perfect clarity. 84 American soldiers standing in a Belgian field with their hands raised. Machine guns opening fire, men falling, men running. Men dying in the snow with bullets in their backs. The SS troops had laughed while they executed prisoners. They had walked among the bodies delivering finishing shots to anyone who still moved. The survivors had crawled through freezing darkness for hours before reaching friendly lines. Their testimony spread through the American forces with the speed of wildfire. The Germans were murdering prisoners. The rules had changed. Surrender no longer meant captivity. Surrender meant execution. This information transformed Funk's decision matrix completely. The German officer screaming in his face represented not a captor but an executioner. The 90 armed soldiers surrounding him were not prison guards but firing squad members. Submission would not preserve life. Submission would guarantee death. The only variable was timing. Surrender now and die in this farmhouse yard. Fight now and probably die in this farmhouse yard. The mathematics remained impossible, but the equation had shifted. Certain death versus probable death. A small difference, a crucial difference. Combat psychologists who later studied the Holtzheim incident focused on the laughter. Why did Funk laugh? The question fascinated researchers because laughter represents one of the most poorly understood human responses. We laugh at jokes. We laugh from joy. We laugh from nervousness. We laugh from relief. Sometimes we laugh for no discernible reason at all. The laughter response appears to serve multiple psychological functions depending on context. In social situations, laughter builds bonds and signals non-threat. In stressful situations, laughter releases tension and restores cognitive function. In impossible situations, laughter may represent a complete breakdown of normal response patterns. A kind of psychological reset that occurs when the brain cannot process incoming information through standard channels. Funk himself offered limited insight into his mental state during those critical seconds. He described the laughter as uncontrollable, as something that seized him and would not release its grip. The German officer screaming in an incomprehensible language struck him as absurd. The entire situation struck him as absurd. Here he stood, surrounded by enemies, with a gun in his gut, and this man kept yelling things he could not understand. What was he supposed to do? Nod? Shake his head? The communication breakdown created a moment of pure absurdity in the midst of mortal danger. An absurdity, for reasons psychology has never fully explained, triggers laughter. The laughter served a tactical purpose whether Funk intended it or not. The German officer had executed this maneuver many times before. He knew how prisoners behaved. They blanched. They trembled. They raised their hands higher. They babbled pleas for mercy. They complied immediately with every command. This American was doing none of those things. He was bent over laughing, shoulders shaking, tears streaming down his face. The German's mental model of prisoner behavior had no category for this response. His brain required additional processing time to interpret the situation. Those processing seconds created an opening. The Thompson submachine gun hung from Funk's shoulder in the standard paratrooper carry position. The weapon represented both his greatest asset and his greatest liability. 30 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition could inflict tremendous damage at close range. The Thompson's reputation as a manstopper was well-deserved. Each round carried enough energy to drop a charging enemy instantly. The rate of fire, 600 rounds per minute, allowed a skilled operator to sweep multiple targets in seconds. The weapon's weight and bulk made it unwieldy for traditional infantry tactics, but perfect for the close-quarters combat paratroopers frequently encountered. Funk had carried this Thompson through Normandy and Holland. He knew its capabilities intimately. He knew exactly how many seconds remained in a magazine at full automatic. He knew the muscle memory required for combat reloading. He knew the weapon would not jam if he maintained it properly. The Thompson was an extension of his body, a tool so familiar that operating it required no conscious thought. The German officer watched Funk's hand move toward the weapon. This appeared to be compliance. The American was finally surrendering his gun. The laughter had been strange, but the outcome would be normal. Another prisoner, another weapon confiscated, another small victory in the endless grinding war. The officer may have relaxed slightly. His finger may have eased on the trigger of his MP40. These small physical adjustments, invisible to observers, created additional fractions of seconds in Funk's favor. The movement that followed occurred faster than conscious thought could direct. Funk's hand closed on the Thompson's pistol grip. His arm swung the weapon down and forward. The muzzle aligned with the German officer's chest. His finger found the trigger and squeezed. The entire sequence occupied less time than a single heartbeat. Thousands of hours of training had burned this movement into Funk's motor cortex. He did not think about shooting. He simply shot. The distinction matters enormously in combat situations. Thinking requires time. Reaction requires time. Trained response requires almost no time at all. The German officer was dead before his brain registered that the American had moved. The first burst emptied into the officer's chest at contact range. 30 caliber .45 rounds traveling at nearly 1,000 feet per second struck flesh and bone with devastating effect. The human body contains remarkable redundancy and resilience, but no biological system can withstand that level of trauma. The officer collapsed backward, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as his dying fingers convulsed on the trigger. Funk was already pivoting, already seeking new targets, already calculating the geometry of survival. The 90 Germans surrounding the farmhouse yard faced their own decision matrix in that moment. Their officer was down. An American was firing into their midst. The situation had transformed from controlled prisoner collection to active firefight in less than 2 seconds. Some reached for weapons, some dove for cover. Some froze completely, their brains unable to process the sudden reversal. The frozen ones died first. Funk swept his Thompson across the nearest cluster of soldiers, the muzzle climbing slightly with recoil as rounds left the barrel. Men screamed. Men fell. Blood sprayed across the pristine snow in patterns that would remain visible for days. The magazine ran dry. Funk had burned through 30 rounds in approximately 3 seconds. This represented the critical vulnerability of the Thompson in sustained combat. High rate of fire consumed ammunition rapidly. Reloading required removing the empty magazine, inserting a fresh one, and cycling the bolt to chamber the first round. A practiced operator could complete this sequence in approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds was an eternity when surrounded by enemies. Funk's hands executed the reload without conscious direction. The empty magazine dropped free, a fresh magazine slammed home. The bolt racked back and released. Fresh rounds were chambered and ready to fire. The entire sequence occurred while Funk continued moving, continued seeking cover, continued screaming at his men to arm themselves. The 4 American guards had recovered from their initial shock. They scrambled across the bloody snow toward fallen German rifles. Seconds earlier, they had been prisoners awaiting execution. Now they were combatants fighting for survival. The Germans who had recovered from their surprise began returning fire. Rounds cracked past Funk's head. One bullet found the American soldier who had been standing beside him when the confrontation began. That man dropped without a sound, killed instantly by a round through the brain. Funk registered the loss peripherally and continued fighting. Grief would come later. Survival demanded focus now. The Thompson spoke again, shorter bursts this time as Funk conserved ammunition and selected targets. The 4 guards had secured weapons and added their fire to the engagement. 5 Americans against 80-plus Germans, but the Americans held crucial advantages. They had initiated the engagement. They occupied central position while the Germans were scattered around the yard's perimeter. They were fighting with desperate fury while the Germans were fighting in confusion. The psychological momentum had shifted completely in those first seconds. Combat has a rhythm that experienced soldiers learn to read and exploit. Engagements ebb and flow as one side or the other gains momentary advantage. The side that maintains initiative, that keeps attacking, that refuses to allow the enemy time to reorganize, typically prevails regardless of numerical disadvantage. Funk understood this rhythm instinctively. He kept moving, kept firing, kept screaming commands that forced his men to act rather than think. Thinking would paralyze them. Action would save them. The engagement lasted approximately 60 seconds from first shot to final surrender. In those 60 seconds, 21 German soldiers died. 24 more sustained wounds serious enough to remove them from the fight. The survivors, more than 40 men, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. They had watched their officer die. They had watched their comrades fall in heaps. They had no stomach for continuing a fight against an enemy who seemed immune to impossible odds. The Americans collected weapons, organized prisoners, and secured the farmhouse yard. The threat to Company C's rear had been eliminated. The mission could continue. Funk stood in the center of the carnage, smoke rising from his Thompson's barrel, surrounded by the bodies of men he had killed. His hands trembled slightly as adrenaline began to fade. The shaking would continue for hours. Combat stress manifests physically long after the danger passes. Funk looked at the destruction around him and spoke to his surviving men. That, he said, was the stupidest thing I have ever seen. The understatement was characteristic. Leonard Funk did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself a soldier who had done what circumstances required. The path that led Leonard Funk to that farmhouse yard began in the steel towns of western Pennsylvania during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Braddock Township sat along the Monongahela River, 8 miles east of Pittsburgh, a community defined entirely by the enormous steel mills that lined the waterfront. Smoke poured from foundry stacks 24 hours a day. The air tasted of sulfur and iron. Men worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Molten metal splashed and burned. Heavy machinery crushed limbs and ended lives. The pay was decent by Depression standards. The work was available when work anywhere else was scarce. Families built lives around the mills, generation after generation, feeding sons into the furnaces and rolling. Mills that produced the steel beams and railroad tracks and bridge supports that built modern America. Leonard Funk was born into this world on August 27, 1916, the son of working-class parents in a working-class town. His childhood coincided with the boom years of the 1920s, when steel demand seemed limitless and prosperity appeared permanent. The crash of 1929 shattered those illusions. Steel orders collapsed as construction projects halted and automobile production plummeted. Mills that had operated around the clock began reducing shifts. Then they began laying off workers. Then they began closing entirely. By the time Funk graduated high school in 1934, the Great Depression had ground through its fifth year with no end in sight. The unemployment rate in steel towns exceeded 30%. Young men who should have been starting careers found themselves competing with their fathers and older brothers for jobs that did not exist. Funk took what work he could find: store clerk, day laborer, whatever paid enough to contribute to family expenses. His father had died or abandoned the family, details that historical records do not preserve clearly. What records do show is that young Leonard assumed responsibility for his younger brother at an age when most boys were still being cared for themselves. This early burden of responsibility shaped his character in ways that would prove crucial later. He learned to provide for others before providing for himself. He learned that leadership meant sacrifice. He learned that complaining about circumstances changed nothing while acting to improve them might change everything. The late 1930s brought gradual economic recovery and growing anxiety about events overseas. Germany had rearmed and begun swallowing its neighbors. Japan had invaded China and committed atrocities that shocked the world. Italy had conquered Ethiopia with poison gas and machine guns. The European democracies, exhausted by the Great War and paralyzed by economic troubles, offered only protests and economic sanctions that accomplished nothing. America watched from across two oceans, protected by geography and determined to avoid entanglement in foreign quarrels. The prevailing sentiment held that European wars were European problems. America had sent its boys to die in French trenches once. It would not make that mistake again. The draft changed everything. Selective service, instituted in 1940, required all men between 21 and 35 to register for potential military service. Lottery numbers determined who would be called. Funk's number came up in June 1941. He reported to the induction center at Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a 24-year-old man of modest physical dimensions. 5 feet 5 inches tall. 140 pounds. The examining physicians probably looked at him and saw administrative duty. Small men typically ended up as clerks or cooks or supply handlers. The Army sorted its manpower according to physical capability. Large, strong men went to combat units. Smaller men went to support roles. This sorting mechanism made practical sense for an army expecting to fight a conventional war with conventional infantry tactics. Funk had other ideas. He volunteered for the Paratroopers. In 1941, American airborne forces barely existed as a concept. The Germans had used paratroopers with devastating effect during their conquest of Western Europe. Airborne units had seized crucial bridges and fortifications in Holland and Belgium, enabling the rapid armored advances that collapsed French defenses in weeks. American military planners recognized the potential of this new form of warfare, but had only begun developing capabilities to match. The first American parachute units were forming at Fort Benning, Georgia, attracting volunteers from across the Army who sought challenges beyond what conventional infantry offered. The men who volunteered for airborne duty shared certain characteristics that set them apart from typical soldiers. They sought difficulty rather than avoiding it. They wanted to prove themselves against the most demanding standards the military could impose. They believed themselves capable of achievements that ordinary soldiers could not match. Some were driven by ego, others by patriotism, others by a simple desire to escape the boredom of garrison life. Whatever their individual motivations, they shared a willingness to accept extraordinary risk in exchange for the opportunity to become extraordinary soldiers. Paratrooper training was designed to identify men who possessed the physical capability and psychological resilience required for airborne operations. The 5-week program began with physical conditioning so brutal that half of all candidates washed out before completing it. Running, climbing, jumping, falling, repeating until muscles screamed and minds begged for relief. The instructors showed no mercy. Men who could not meet the standards were sent back to regular units. Men who complained about the difficulty were sent back. Men who showed any hesitation about jumping were sent back. The filtering process was deliberate and relentless. Only those who truly wanted to be paratroopers would survive to earn their wings. Funk survived. His small stature proved no disadvantage in training that emphasized endurance over raw strength. His maturity provided stability when younger men cracked under pressure. His experience providing for his brother had taught him to push through difficulty without complaint. When the moment came to step from a C-47 transport aircraft into empty air at 1,200 feet, Funk did not hesitate. The ground rushed up. The parachute deployed. He floated down and landed and stood up and realized he had transformed into something new. He was a paratrooper. The jump wings pinned to his chest marked him as a member of an elite brotherhood. The training had not merely taught him skills. It had rebuilt him into a different kind of soldier. Assignment to Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment followed basic airborne training. The 508th was a newly formed unit still building its identity and capabilities. The men came from across America, drawn together by their shared willingness to jump from aircraft into enemy territory. They trained together through 1942 and 1943, building the cohesion that combat units require to function under fire. Officers learned their men's capabilities and limitations. NCOs like Funk learned to lead small units through complex tactical problems. The regiment developed its own culture, its own traditions, its own sense of superiority over conventional forces. Funk rose through the ranks faster than his peers. His age, 27 by the time the regiment shipped overseas, made him ancient by paratrooper standards. Most of his squad mates had barely reached their 20th birthdays. They possessed youth and vigor, and the immortality that young men believe they carry. Funk possessed something more valuable. He had maturity. He had judgment. He had the quiet competence that made men trust him in situations where trust meant survival. His promotion to squad leader came naturally. His eventual elevation to acting company executive officer reflected the respect he had earned through months of shared hardship and preparation. The regiment shipped to England in late 1943 and joined the 82nd Airborne Division. The famed All-Americans who had already jumped into combat in Sicily and Italy. These veterans had seen what airborne operations actually looked like when bullets were flying and friends were dying. They had experienced the chaos of night drops into hostile territory. They had fought their way through enemy positions with weapons captured from the dead because supply drops had gone astray. Their experience sobered the newcomers. War would be nothing like training had suggested. War would be worse in ways that training could not prepare them for. D-Day approached. June 6, 1944. The invasion of Normandy. The greatest amphibious assault in human history. The paratroopers would jump in the night before the beach landings, securing key positions behind the German coastal defenses. Their mission was to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours when the seaborne troops would be most vulnerable. Everything depended on the airborne forces achieving surprise and creating chaos in the German rear. Nothing went according to plan. Anti-aircraft fire scattered the transport formations across 50 miles of French countryside. Paratroopers who should have landed together in organized units came down alone or in small groups, miles from their designated drop zones. Many landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others dropped into the middle of German encampments and died fighting before they could cut free of their harness. The night became a chaos of scattered firefights and lost soldiers and desperate men seeking any friendly face in the darkness. Funk landed hard. His ankle twisted on impact with pain that suggested serious sprain or possible fracture. Every step would be agony for weeks. A rational man would have found a hiding place and waited for friendly forces to reach him. Funk was not interested in rationality. He was interested in completing his mission. He buried his parachute, oriented himself by the stars, and began moving toward his objective. He was 40 miles from his designated drop zone. 40 miles of German-occupied territory filled with enemy soldiers actively hunting for paratroopers. The task appeared impossible. Within hours, Funk had gathered a group of lost soldiers. Men from different units, different companies, different regiments. 18 of them eventually, all seeking leadership in a situation where every familiar structure had collapsed. Funk provided what they needed. He assessed their capabilities, organized them into a functional unit, and began leading them toward friendly lines. He insisted on serving as lead scout despite his injured ankle, placing himself in the most dangerous position to protect the men who had placed their trust in him. 10 days. 10 days of moving through enemy territory, traveling at night, hiding by day, fighting when they had no choice, scavenging food and water from farms and streams, evading German patrols that crisscrossed the countryside hunting for scattered paratroopers. The journey tested every skill Funk had developed through years of training: navigation without maps, tactical movement through hostile terrain, leadership of men on the edge of exhaustion and despair. He met each challenge and overcame it. He kept his men alive. He kept them moving. He kept them believing that survival was possible. June 17th, 11 days after the invasion. Funk led his group into friendly lines. Every single man survived. Not one casualty. 40 miles of German-occupied France. 10 days of constant danger. 18 lives that might have been lost 100 different ways. Leonard Funk brought them all home. The Silver Star. Third highest combat decoration the United States military awards. Plus a Bronze Star for meritorious service throughout the campaign. Plus his first Purple Heart for the ankle injury that had never stopped him from leading. Funk accepted the decorations without comment. He was not interested in recognition. He was interested in winning the war. And the war was far from over. September 1944 brought Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history. 35,000 paratroopers dropping into the Netherlands to capture bridges across the Rhine River system. British, American, and Polish forces jumping together in an operation that Field Marshal Montgomery promised would end the war by Christmas. The plan was ambitious. Perhaps too ambitious. The paratroopers would have to capture and hold 7 bridges across 64 miles of Dutch territory while ground forces raced up a single highway to link up with them. Everything depended on speed, surprise, and nothing going wrong. Everything went wrong. The British 1st Airborne Division landed at Arnhem, the furthest bridge, and discovered SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had failed to detect. For 9 days they fought and died in the streets while the ground forces struggled to reach them. Only 2,000 of 10,000 men escaped. The operation became known as a bridge too far and entered military history as a cautionary tale about the limits of airborne operations. Funk and the 508th operated near Nijmegen, helping to secure bridges in the southern portion of the operation. The work was difficult and dangerous, but lacked the apocalyptic character of the fighting at Arnhem. Standard paratrooper operations: seize objectives, hold them against counterattack, wait for ground forces to arrive. The regiment performed its assigned tasks competently. Then Funk noticed something that was not part of any plan. 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns had established positions on high ground overlooking the incoming glider landing zones. Allied gliders were arriving continuously, carrying jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition, and medical supplies essential for sustaining the airborne bridgehead. The German guns were firing into the landing gliders with devastating effect. Each aircraft hit meant men and equipment lost. If the guns continued operating, hundreds would die before reaching the ground. The gun position was dug in with sandbags, camouflage, and interlocking fields of fire. Approximately 20 German soldiers manned the weapons and provided security. Standard military doctrine held that assaulting prepared positions required a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Funk had 3 men. He was outnumbered 7-to-1. He attacked anyway. Leading from the front, Funk and his 3-man patrol stormed the German position. They killed the security detachment, seized the gun emplacements, and neutralized all 3 weapons along with their crews. 20 Germans against 4 Americans. The guns fell silent. The gliders landed safely. The Distinguished Service Cross. Second highest decoration for valor. 1 step below the Medal of Honor. Funk now possessed a Silver Star and a DSC, 2 of the rarest combat decorations in the American military. Most soldiers who earned even one were considered heroes for life. Funk had accumulated both in 4 months of combat. He would add more before the war ended. December 1944. The Ardennes. Dense forest along the Belgian-German border. A quiet sector held by green troops and exhausted veterans pulled from the line to rest and refit. American commanders believed the terrain too difficult for major German operations. They were wrong. The German offensive struck with 3 armies, 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces. The assault crashed through American lines with speed that recalled the Blitzkrieg victories of 1940. Entire divisions crumbled. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. The German advance created a bulge 50 miles deep in the Allied lines. threatening to split the Allied armies and capture the crucial port of Antwerp. Hitler's plan was desperate and arguably insane, but it came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest engagement the American army fought in World War II. 89,000 American casualties before the fighting ended. The weather conditions matched the combat intensity. Snow, ice, temperatures dropping to 5 degrees below zero. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Weapons jammed as lubricants solidified. Vehicles refused to start. The cold killed nearly as effectively as German bullets. One day into the offensive came calamity. The event that would shape Leonard Funk's decision at Holtzheim occurred on December 17, 1944, near a crossroads called Bognes. A convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion encountered the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS armored battle group leading the German advance. The Americans were rear-echelon troops, artillery observers, and radio operators, not equipped to fight tanks and armored infantry. After a brief engagement, 113 Americans surrendered. They were herded into a farmer's field and ordered to stand with their hands raised. The SS opened fire. Machine guns, pistols, rifles. The Germans shot prisoners who stood still and prisoners who ran. They walked among the fallen, delivering finishing shots to anyone who showed signs of life. 84 Americans died in that field. 43 survived by playing dead, lying motionless in the snow while German boots walked past and German voices laughed above them. When darkness fell, the survivors crawled away and reached American lines. Their testimony spread through the army within hours. The impact of Normandy on American forces cannot be overstated. Before the massacre, the war in Europe had operated according to unwritten rules. Soldiers surrendered when situations became hopeless. Prisoners received treatment specified by the Geneva Convention. Both sides observed a grim professionalism toward enemy combatants. Normandy destroyed those assumptions. The Germans were murdering prisoners. Surrender meant death. American soldiers swore they would never submit to the SS. Some units passed orders to take no SS prisoners. The war had become something darker and more terrible. Leonard Funk received the news and made his decision. He would never surrender to the Germans, no matter the circumstances. No matter the odds. He would fight until he prevailed or died. There would be no third option. January 1945. The German offensive had been broken. Allied forces were counterattacking, pushing the Bulge back toward the German border. Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, received orders to capture the Belgian village of Holtzheim. The assignment was routine by late war standards. Clear the village. Eliminate resistance. Secure the position for follow-on forces. The complication lay in Company C's depleted condition. Months of continuous combat had reduced the unit to a fraction of its authorized strength. The executive officer, second in command below the company commander, had been killed in recent fighting. They barely had enough men for the assault. Funk was now acting executive officer. He examined his roster and made a characteristic decision. He walked to the company headquarters tent where clerks, supply personnel, and cooks went about their administrative duties. These men had spent most of the war behind desks, processing paperwork and preparing meals. They had received basic training months or years earlier but had never faced combat. Funk addressed them directly. "You are all infantry now. Grab your weapons. We are taking that village." The makeshift platoon that Funk assembled numbered approximately 30 men. They had no combat experience. Their training was months out of date. They were frightened and uncertain and wholly unprepared for what awaited them. Funk did not care about their limitations. He cared about their potential. He would turn them into soldiers through the simple expedient of leading them into battle and expecting them to perform. The march to Holtzheim covered 15 miles through waist-deep snow in a driving blizzard. Temperatures hovered well below freezing. German artillery shells exploded around them, harassing fire intended to disrupt movement and inflict casualties. Funk led from the front, setting the pace, demonstrating through example that conditions which seemed unbearable could in fact be endured. His clerks, his improvised warriors, followed because he expected them to follow and because his confidence made following seem possible. They reached Holtzheim and Funk organized the assault. 15 houses held German defenders, machine guns, rifles, grenades. Close-quarters urban combat, the most difficult and dangerous form of infantry warfare. Funk led his men through the village, clearing buildings one at a time, killing or capturing every enemy they encountered. 30 prisoners taken. Not one American casualty. The clerks who had never fired shots in anger had become soldiers in the space of a few hours. Other elements of the company captured 50 additional prisoners elsewhere in the village. 80 Germans total, corralled in the yard of a farmhouse under guard. Funk examined his exhausted men. They had been marching and fighting for hours. Resistance continued in other parts of the village. He could spare only 4 soldiers to watch the prisoners. He assigned the guards and returned to the fight. Reinforcements would arrive eventually. Until then, 4 men would have to suffice. What happened next would earn Leonard Funk the Medal of Honor. A German patrol approached the farmhouse while Funk was clearing the remaining resistance in Holtzheim. The patrol wore white camouflage capes over their uniforms. In the snow and confusion, they appeared nearly identical to American troops in winter gear. The 4 guards failed to recognize the threat until German weapons were pointed at their heads. The guards surrendered. The Germans freed the 80 prisoners and began distributing weapons from the confiscated pile. 90 armed Germans organized in the yard of a farmhouse, preparing to attack Company C from the rear. The American soldiers scattered across the village had no idea what was happening behind them. They were focused on enemies to their front, not prisoners who should have been secured. If 90 Germans struck while the company was dispersed and unprepared, the result would be massacre. The German officer in charge began issuing orders. Machine guns positioned here. Ambush established there. Wait for the signal. The plan was sound. The execution would have been devastating. That was when Leonard Funk walked around the corner. The confrontation has entered military legend for good reason. Funk had come to check on the prisoners, a routine task in the midst of ongoing operations. He expected to find 4 guards watching 80 disarmed Germans. He found 90 armed enemies preparing for attack. His 4 guards knelt in the snow with their hands behind their heads. The German officer spotted Funk immediately and strode forward, jamming an MP-40 submachine gun into the sergeant's stomach while screaming commands in German. Funk did not speak German. He had no idea what the officer was saying. The officer screamed louder, face reddening with rage. Funk looked at the 90 enemies surrounding him. He looked at his helpless men. He looked at the weapon pressed against his gut, and he began to laugh. The laughter changed everything. The German officer expected compliance, submission, fear. He received instead the sight of an American sergeant bent over cackling as if someone had told a magnificent joke. The officer's mental framework for handling prisoners had no category for this response. His brain required additional processing time to interpret what was happening. Those processing seconds were all Leonard Funk needed. Still laughing, Funk reached toward his Thompson. The movement appeared to be compliance, the beginning of surrendering his weapon. The German officer relaxed slightly. Then Funk moved with speed that combat training had burned into his nervous system. The Thompson swung down, the muzzle aligned. The trigger squeezed. The German officer was dead before he understood what had happened. 60 seconds of continuous violence followed. Funk killed and killed and killed, burning through magazines and reloading faster than thought. His 4 guards scrambled for weapons and joined the fight. The Germans died and died and died, their numerical advantage rendered meaningless by confusion and poor positioning and an enemy who seemed to welcome death rather than fear it. 21 Germans killed, 24 wounded. The survivors surrendered. The crisis ended as suddenly as it had begun. Leonard Funk stood amid the carnage, surrounded by bodies, smoke curling from his Thompson's barrel, and offered his characteristic assessment. That was the stupidest thing I have ever seen. The Medal of Honor recommendation that reached Washington required no embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. 1 American sergeant against 90 armed enemies. A weapon in his stomach, his men captured and helpless. Instead of surrendering, he attacked. Instead of dying, he prevailed. The decoration was approved without question, September 5, 1945. The White House Rose Garden. President Harry's. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Leonard Funk's neck while cameras captured the moment. Truman spoke words that would be repeated for decades. I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States. The statement captured something essential about how Americans understood courage. The most powerful man in the world, the leader who had ended World War II with atomic fire, looked at a 5'5" former store clerk from Pennsylvania and saw something greater than political power. He saw a man who had faced impossible odds and refused to yield. He saw a man who had laughed at death and emerged victorious. The final tally of Leonard Funk's decorations tells the story of a remarkable warrior: Medal of Honor for Holtzheim, Distinguished Service Cross for the anti-aircraft guns in Holland, Silver Star for leading 18 men through 40 miles of enemy territory in Normandy, Bronze Star for meritorious service throughout the campaign, Purple Heart, awarded 3 times for 3 separate wounds, the Croix de Guerre from France, the Order of Leopold from Belgium, the Military Order of William from the Netherlands, their equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Leonard Funk became the most decorated paratrooper of World War II, small in stature, enormous in achievement, a legend among men who jumped from aircraft into enemy fire. The war ended. The decorations were presented. The parades were marched. The nation celebrated victory and turned toward the challenges of peace. Millions of soldiers returned home to rebuild lives interrupted by years of service. They sought jobs, married sweethearts, started families, and tried to forget the terrible things they had seen and done. Most wanted nothing more than to put the war behind them and become ordinary citizens again. Leonard Funk came home and made a choice that revealed more about his character than any combat action ever could. He did not write a book about his experiences. He did not join the lecture circuit trading on his fame. He did not seek political office or corporate position or any of the opportunities that Medal of Honor recipients could command. He returned to Pennsylvania and got a job with the Veterans Administration. The VA represented one of the largest and most important institutions in post-war America. Millions of veterans needed assistance navigating the complex systems of benefits, healthcare, education, and housing that Congress had established to reward their service. The paperwork was Byzantine. The bureaucracy was frustrating. Many veterans lacked the education or persistence to claim what they were owed. They needed advocates who understood both the system and their needs. They needed people who cared about their welfare and would fight for their interests. Funk became one of those advocates. He sat at a desk and processed claims. He cut through red tape for men who had given everything and now struggled to receive basic assistance. He rose through the VA ranks over 27 years, eventually becoming division chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office. Good salary, steady hours, a pension waiting at retirement. The same kind of administrative work he had done before the war, applied now to helping those who had served alongside him. His wife Gertrude stayed with him through the decades. They raised 2 daughters in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, a working-class neighborhood not far from where he had grown up. The Medal of Honor hung in a case somewhere, along with the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star and all the foreign decorations from grateful allies. Funk never displayed them prominently. He never talked about them unless someone asked directly, and even then his answers were brief. Did what I had to do. That was all he ever said. The decades passed. Comrades from the war died one by one. The 508th held reunions that grew smaller each year as age-claimed veterans who had survived Nazi bullets. Funk attended when he could, reconnecting with men who remembered the young sergeant who had led them through impossible situations. They never forgot what he had done. They never stopped respecting the quiet competence that had made them trust him with their lives. November 20th, 1992. Braddock Hills, Pennsylvania. Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. died of cancer at 76 years old. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 35, Grave 23734, among the heroes of every American conflict. At the time of his death, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II. The last of a generation that had jumped into enemy fire and fought its way across Europe to victory. Memorials followed. A fitness center at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, bears his name. A highway in Pennsylvania honors his memory. A post office in McKeesport was dedicated to him in 2023, decades after his death. These tributes preserve his name for future generations, markers ensuring that Leonard Funk will not be entirely forgotten. Most people have never heard of him. They know Audie Murphy, the baby-faced Texan who became the most decorated American soldier of World War II and later a movie star. They know Alvin York, the Tennessee pacifist who became a one-man army in the Argonne Forest of World War I. These names entered popular culture and stayed there. Leonard Funk remained obscure, a hero known mainly to military historians and paratrooper enthusiasts. The obscurity reflects something important about Funk's character. He never sought fame. He never promoted himself. He lived his post-war life in deliberate anonymity, serving others rather than basking in recognition. The Medal of Honor was something he earned, not something he exploited. His heroism was genuine precisely because he never thought of it as heroism. He thought of it as doing what circumstances required. The lesson of Leonard Funk's life extends far beyond military history. Combat does not favor size or strength or conventional advantage. Combat favors those who keep thinking when everyone else has stopped. At Holtzheim, every rational calculation demanded surrender. The mathematics were impossible. The enemy held every advantage. Submission appeared to be the only path to survival. Funk rejected that calculation because he understood what surrender actually meant. He had processed the information from Malmedy and drawn conclusions that transformed his decision matrix. Surrender equaled death. Fighting equaled probable death. Probable death was better than certain death, so he fought. The laughter that preceded his attack remains mysterious even after decades of analysis. Was it tactical? Was it psychological? Was it genuine amusement at the absurdity of his situation? Funk himself could not fully explain why he laughed. Something about the German officers screaming incomprehensible commands struck him as ridiculous. The laughter seized him and would not let go. Whatever its origin, the effect was decisive. Those seconds of confusion created by his unexpected response gave him the opening he needed. Courage is not the absence of fear. Every human being feels fear when facing death. The amygdala fires its ancient warnings. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. The body prepares to fight or flee or freeze. Courage is action in the presence of fear. Courage is choosing to move forward when every instinct demands retreat. Leonard Funk felt fear standing in that farmhouse yard with a gun in his gut. He acknowledged that fear and acted anyway. The action transformed him from potential victim to victorious warrior in 60 seconds of violence. The post-war decades of service matter as much as the combat heroics. Many Medal of Honor recipients struggled to adjust to civilian life. The psychological toll of combat, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, destroyed marriages and careers and lives. Some recipients turned to alcohol or drugs to silence memories that would not fade. Some committed suicide, unable to bear the burden of surviving when so many friends had died. The transition from warrior to citizen proved more difficult than any battle. Funk made the transition successfully. He found purpose in serving others. He built a stable family life. He contributed to his community through decades of quiet work. The same leadership qualities that had kept 18 men alive in Normandy and saved his company at Holtzheim manifested in civilian form as steady competence and dedication to duty. He did not need recognition to feel valuable. He did not need applause to find meaning. He needed only the knowledge that his work helped others, that his existence made a positive difference in the lives of struggling veterans. History remembers the dramatic moments. The farmhouse yard at Holtzheim, the anti-aircraft guns in Holland, the desperate march through Normandy. These events defined Leonard Funk's public legacy. They earned him decorations and recognition and a place in the military history books. They made him a legend among paratroopers who still tell his story 8 decades later. History should also remember the quiet years, the decades at a desk, the thousands of claims processed. The countless veterans helped through a system designed to serve them but often failing in practice. The steady accumulation of small kindnesses and bureaucratic victories that improved lives without attracting attention. Leonard Funk's greatest achievement may not have been the 60 seconds at Holtzheim. His greatest achievement may have been the 27 years that followed, when he could have rested on his laurels, but chose instead to continue serving. The question of why Funk laughed continues to fascinate those who study his story. Psychologists have proposed theories ranging from stress response to deliberate manipulation to pure randomness. Combat veterans who have faced similar situations report various involuntary responses: tears, rage, paralysis, and yes, sometimes laughter. The human brain under extreme stress produces unexpected outputs. Neural pathways designed for everyday situations fail when confronted with circumstances they never evolved to process. The result can be behavior that appears irrational, but may actually represent an alternative form of processing that allows action when normal cognition would freeze. The German officer at Holtzheim had experience handling prisoners. He knew how to establish dominance through volume and physical intimidation. He knew that shouting commands while pressing a weapon against someone's body typically produced immediate compliance. His mental model of human behavior, built through months or years of war, had no accommodation for laughter. When Funk laughed, the officer's brain had to construct a new model to explain the input. That construction process required time. Time was the one resource Leonard Funk could exploit. Whether the laughter was calculated or spontaneous, its effect was decisive. Funk created an opening and exploited it with lethal efficiency. The Thompson submachine gun, wielded by someone who had trained with it until operation became unconscious reflex, transformed a momentary psychological advantage into catastrophic physical reality for the Germans. 21 dead in 60 seconds. A ratio of destruction that seemed impossible given the initial odds. Yet it happened, documented by multiple witnesses and preserved in official records that earned Funk the Medal of Honor. War produces heroes whose names echo through centuries. Achilles at Troy, Alexander at Gaugamela, Napoleon at Austerlitz. These famous warriors commanded armies and conquered empires. Their achievements shaped the fates of nations. Leonard Funk commanded a handful of frightened men and conquered a farmhouse yard in Belgium. His achievement shaped only the immediate tactical situation and the lives of soldiers who would have died had he surrendered. By conventional measures of historical significance, Funk's actions barely register. By human measures, Funk's actions represent something essential about what courage means. He was not a general making decisions from a safe distance. He was a sergeant in the snow with a gun in his gut. He was not weighing strategic considerations. He was calculating whether to live as a prisoner or die as a fighter. He was not thinking about glory or recognition. He was thinking about the men behind him who would be slaughtered if 90 Germans attacked from the rear. The decision to fight emerged from this immediate calculus. Not abstract principle, not ideological commitment. Simple recognition that surrender meant death and fighting meant a chance, however small, at survival for himself and others. That clarity of purpose, combined with the physical capabilities developed through years of training, produced an outcome that seemed miraculous. 1 man against 90, 21 dead enemies. 0 friendly casualties among those who entered the engagement alive. President Truman understood what he was honoring when he placed the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck. He was honoring not merely a military action, but a quality of character. The willingness to fight when fighting appeared hopeless. The refusal to submit when submission appeared sensible. The determination to keep thinking and acting when most human beings would have shut down. These qualities matter beyond military contexts. They matter in every sphere of human endeavor where obstacles appear insurmountable and surrender appears rational. The story of Leonard Funk offers lessons for anyone facing seemingly impossible situations. The odds do not determine outcomes. Determination determines outcomes. The person who keeps thinking when others have stopped, who keeps acting when others have frozen, who refuses to accept apparent reality as actual reality, can achieve results that probability theory says should not occur. This is not magic. This is human capability applied with maximum intensity to specific challenges. Funk never thought of himself as exceptional. He considered himself an ordinary person who did what circumstances required. This self-assessment was accurate in one sense and wildly inaccurate in another. He was ordinary in his origins, his physical dimensions, his post-war life choices. He was extraordinary in his responses to crisis, his leadership capabilities, his unwillingness to accept defeat. The combination of ordinary and extraordinary in one person suggests that exceptional performance lies within more human beings than typically display it. The difference between the ordinary person who surrenders and the extraordinary person who fights may be smaller than we think. The difference may be simply a decision made in a critical moment to act rather than submit. Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. rests at Arlington among thousands of other warriors who served their country. His grave marker looks like all the others, white stone against green grass, name and dates and nothing more. Visitors who walk past have no way of knowing that this particular grave holds. A man who laughed at 90 Germans and killed 21 of them with a Tommy gun. The anonymity would have pleased Funk. He never wanted to stand out. He wanted only to serve, first as a soldier, then as a civil servant helping veterans. Both forms of service express the same fundamental commitment to others over self. The Medal of Honor citation concludes with words that capture the essence of what Funk did at Holtzheim. His bold initiative and heroic action in the face of overwhelming odds and seemingly certain death exemplifies the highest standard of courage and determination. These formal phrases, drafted by military bureaucrats and approved by review boards, attempt to convey something that words ultimately cannot capture. They attempt to describe what it feels like to stand alone against 90 enemies and choose to fight. The story deserves to be remembered. Not because Leonard Funk was uniquely heroic, though he was. Not because his actions were uniquely significant, though they were. The story deserves to be remembered because it demonstrates what human beings are capable of achieving when they refuse to accept limitations that appear absolute. 90-1. Gun in the gut, men on their knees. Every calculation demanding surrender. And one short clerk from Pennsylvania who decided to laugh instead. If this account of Leonard Funk's extraordinary life has captured your attention, if his story of courage under impossible circumstances has moved you, consider subscribing to this channel. More stories of remarkable individuals await discovery. More lessons from history remain to be shared. The past contains countless examples of human beings rising above apparent limitations to achieve what seemed impossible. Leonard Funk was one such person. There are many others. Subscribe to learn their stories and draw inspiration for your own challenges, whatever form they may take.